Welcome, bem-vindos. Good afternoon, boa tarde. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our first event of the Brazil Lab Colloquium this fall. It's wonderful to see so many of you coming from so many corners of the world, but also of our campus. My name is João Bill. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology and also direct the Brazil Lab and co-direct the Princeton Global Health Program. And I want to thank Pedro Meira Monteiro, Miquel Mugi, and Carol Dopp for helping to organize this event, for having been in contact with our wonderful speakers for today, Laura Carvalho and Celso Rocha de Barros. We began the Brazil Lab last year, and it really has become a wonderful intellectual space on campus where we can come from our various interests, our various experiences in various places of the world to think about pressing issues for which Brazil is good to think with. And our idea when we created the lab was that the lab would be a nexus, so to speak, for people from various fields, various disciplines to come together around pressing issues, such the Amazon, democratic insecurities, economic insecurities, the precariousness of advancement in socioeconomic rights, and so on, that Brazil is now really an impressive laboratory, so to speak, for us to try to understand the complicated nature of the political, the economic, and the social in our present times. So in that spirit, we thought, let's begin our session, really talk our session this fall, talking about radicalized Brazil. Now what? We have seen this incredible polarization that has happened, and Brazil is emblematic of larger trends, from the United States to Turkey to Western Europe, but again, Brazil has its own peculiarities, and we have one of the most important young public intellectuals with us today in Brazil, Laura Carvalho and Celso Rocha de Barros. And before introducing them, I also want to invite you for our event that's taking place next week. We are going to have the wonderful writer, Giovanni Martins, whose book, O Sol na Cabeça, The Sun on My Head, has just been published in English by Forrester and Giraud. He will be here next Tuesday on an event on noon on Tuesday, and you're all invited to participate. If you are not yet on the listserv, on the mailing list of the Brazil Lab, please go to our website and you register on a mailing list, and you'll be able to get notes on the forthcoming events. So at noon next week, September 24th, in 161 Louis Simpson. And our next colloquium will be talking about public security and democracy in Brazil with Ilona Swabo, and Professor Deborah Yashar from the Department of Politics will be the discussion. That said, Laura Carvalho is professor of economics at the University of São Paulo. She earned her PhD nearby here from the New School. And her best-selling book, Valsa Brasileira, The Brazilian Waltz, which has a little bit one step forward, one step to the side, one step back, right? How do you account for this mobility or repetitions as well within the Brazilian economy? Is one of the rare cases that an economics book becomes actually a national bestseller. She's a wonderful storyteller as well. That goes along with her incredible way of assessing the present day of economic realities in Brazil through her publications as well on Folha de São Paulo, where she's a columnist. Well, so Celso Rocha de Barros is a sociologist, an analyst for the Brazilian Central Bank. He holds a degree in political science from the State University of Campinas, Unicamp, and a PhD in sociology from Oxford University. Barros also is a columnist for the Folha de São Paulo. So we have with us this wonderful combination, and one of the things that we felt we did right in the Brazil Lab is to put together people who work in different fields, but also adjacently. And the lab to become a space for people to experiment with ideas. We don't have ready-made language for our times of what's going on, and the lab wants to be a space in which people can try things out. So in that spirit, of welcoming conversations across fields, across disciplines, and also experimenting with thought. Let's give a warm welcome to Laura and Celso, and then Laura will be our first presenter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again, Miquel, João, and Marcelo for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's the second time I'm at the lab in less than a year. Last time I came to talk about the Brazilian economic crisis. Now I think our crisis became way more dramatic, and it involves many other aspects: an environmental crisis, a political crisis, and so I'm going a little bit out of my own field here in this talk, and in fact, it's great to have an audience with non-economists so that I can maybe get some feedback on these ideas, and I feel less the economist who is just thinking that we can talk about anything because we manage some data. That's not what I want to do here. The idea is really to try to make the link between the political scenario in Brazil and the economic scenario in Brazil, and listen to your feedback. So I'll make more. Maybe I'll ask more questions than give me answers at this talk. So the idea here today, I mean, the title of the session was Radicalized Brazil, Now What? It tends to lead us to a conversation about our prospects, and I will do that at the very end of the talk, but I will start by trying to understand how the Brazilian shift to the right and to the far right can actually be understood within current understandings of other processes of emergences of the far right around the world. So how can we draw, I mean, if we look at the current literature, and in particular the literature that is focusing on economic factors behind those elections or the rise of the far right in different ways in different countries, where does Brazil fit? So are we really that much different, or do we have similarities? That will be the first part of the talk. Then I will move to the now what part of the talk and what can we expect. I'm hoping that Celso will be more optimistic than me because I don't want to leave you with the terrible impression that I have at the moment. Okay, so basically the motivation here is twofold. We have among economists, right, an understanding that in the rich countries or advanced economies in general, globalization and the decline of the middle class in particular is one of the factors or one of the economic factors behind the rise of the far right. That hypothesis was very well described in Branko Milanovic's book, but also other studies and authors have built on that. Then, to take another economist, Danny Roderick from Harvard, also sets up this idea in a paper about populism around the world, that in fact Europe and even the US have a different type of populism, the right-wing populism arising as a consequence of globalization, than Latin America, for instance, which would tend to have left-wing populism as arising from polarization. Of course, this was a few years ago. And the idea there, the hypothesis there, is that basically both are the consequence of globalization, but there are different types of globalization shocks. So while European countries are more subject to immigration and to these issues related to nationalism, Latin America would be more subject to the financial globalization part of the story, and therefore the reaction to it would be more a reaction against, for instance, multinationals, the IMF, multilateral institutions, and that's why politicians in the populist spectrum there would tend to take advantage of that understanding to basically blame on the rich or the status quo in terms of the financial elites and so on, rather than on based on identity type of cleavages, right? So he talks about two different types of societal cleavages that are explored by politicians. The right-wing populism type of cleavage would be an identity cleavage-driven idea, whereas the left-wing economic populism, as he calls it, would be based on income cleavages. And so this would be the explanation for why Latin America would have more left-wing populist politicians and Europe would have the other type of populism as rising. So, well, that's clearly not the case now in Brazil. We see a country that is in Latin America that has all the aspects and characteristics that Danny Roderick was talking about. But in fact, we are seeing maybe the most extreme case of right-wing populism we have today around the world. I don't want to make it better for anyone, but maybe that's the one optimistic note you can end this session with. I mean, we're probably worse off at the moment. And so how does Jair Bolsonaro's election in Brazil fit into this picture? And how can it add, or how can it change, or maybe how can it challenge current understanding of what drives these phenomena? So I'll start with basically six types of empirical evidence that we have for the global north. So here I'll focus on what the existing empirical evidence tells us about those hypotheses and other hypotheses that actually talks about economic factors behind those elections. So that we can then see if Brazil has something to do with it, right? So the first type of evidence, and there is a large literature building up on this, analyzing election data for different countries, that actually tries to see whether cultural factors were more important or less important than economic factors for these phenomena, right? And in fact, one of the first studies to be published on that, along that line is a study of 268 parties in more than 30 countries that finds that cultural values seem to have a better explanatory power for those election patterns than economic factors. And so this would tend to reject, say, the type of Milanovic explanation or even the Roderick's explanation that look at globalization, the loss of manufacturing jobs, and other economic aspects in these elections. But in fact, this is also contradicted by other studies in that same literature. So for instance, just to take an example, there is a paper by Green and McAwee, 2019, that actually splits American voters between black voters and white voters, and sees that for black voters, in fact, economic aspects are more relevant, but for non-voting behavior, not for the choice on Donald Trump. So in the 2016 elections, whereas for white voters, identity aspects seem to be more relevant. So that already gives us a bit of a clue on differences even among classes and among ethnic minorities or in this type of behavior and what explains the voting behavior. There's also another paper that shows that the long-run change in average income per capita in UK districts seems to be very much associated with support for Brexit. So that would tend to, again, stress an economic, more long-run than short-run, but still an economic factor behind these phenomena. Then there's another I would say there is another literature that is more economic. It's an economic literature, which is basically doing econometrics with causal mechanisms to identify it really very well what drives those elections. There are 4 different papers in that same line that tries to see whether exposure to Chinese imports benefited non-moderate candidates in these countries. This literature has done it for the US, for Brexit, for Germany, and basically finds that, yes, districts that are more subject to Chinese imports tend to vote non-moderate with a much higher probability. Then there's a recent paper focusing on austerity. It's really recent. It was published in 2019 by Fetzer, which actually shows that cuts in social programs in the UK seem to have a big impact on support for Brexit as well. So districts that are subject to more cuts, because since austerity started in the UK in 2010, seem to, and where people are actually more exposed to social benefits, seem to vote pro-Brexit, if you compare it with places where these shocks did not happen, where cuts were not as spread or as big. Finally, a different paper that relates to this actually shows that social housing programs, after a regulatory change was done in Europe, in Austria in particular, that actually allowed immigrants to get access to social housing, you saw a big increase in support for the far right in Austria, which the authors explain as driven by the distributive conflict, or the increase in the distributive conflict over the provision of public goods, in this case, in particular, social housing. So this is just to say that there's already different views and very different aspects, even though they're all maybe linked somehow. And of course, even the distinction between cultural and economic factors may be more blurred than that, given that sometimes the economic situation or the material situation sets the ground for more cultural approaches to, say, blame different people for that economic situation, which is exactly what Danny Roderick was talking about. But still, already this literature for the rich countries is not very well established, but you do have very interesting results that are being found. So the question is, what about Brazil? What can we say about Brazil if we relate to that literature, right? So to start with, of course, globalization had a very ambiguous effect in the Brazilian economy, as it did with other commodity exporting economies. So as opposed to advanced economies where clearly globalization led only, let's say, to costs, big costs in terms of jobs in manufacturing, at least in the short run, in Brazil, as a commodity exporting economy, we benefited a lot in the 2000s in terms of economic growth, and even we used that as an opportunity to expand public investment, expand social spending without incurring in an increase in public debt to GDP ratio. So basically the Chinese growth, which actually led to a big increase in the price of oils, soybeans, iron ore, and other goods that Brazil exports a lot, and not only us, I mean, in Latin American countries in general, and even other Russia and other BRIC economies were benefited in the 2000s by this phenomenon. So the first thing one could say is, well, but you benefited from globalization. So of course, globalization could not be the cause for the rise of the far right over there, right? It is also true that during this period, thanks to both policies and the good external scenario, you ended up with strong employment, strong job growth, real wage growth, and particularly real wage growth at the very bottom of the distribution, which is something that you don't see since the 1980s in economies like the US. I mean, you started seeing some growth in wages at the bottom now because the unemployment rate is really low, but that's exactly one of the things that are missing in the past couple of decades. So there, again, we could say maybe that's not then the driver of this phenomenon. And in fact, this is true to some degree. If you compare several countries, and in the x-axis there, in the horizontal axis, you see growth in commodity terms of trade, meaning the price of our exports relative to the price of our imports. And in the vertical axis, you see the change in the poverty, in extreme poverty. You see that you do tend to have more reduction in extreme poverty the more these countries are benefited. So commodity exporting economies tend to reduce poverty more than non-commodity exporting economies during this period. But it's also true that Brazil is not particularly the country that that benefited the most from the commodity boom, and it's not even the one that reduced poverty the most if you compare it to other Latin American economies to the right of that chart, right? So Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, I mean, these are countries that actually both benefited the most from the boom and also reduced poverty in a more significant way. But then if you look at the Brazilian share of income that goes to the bottom 50%, the middle 40%, and the top 1%, you see that there is a slight increase in the share that goes to the bottom 50%. The top didn't change much, its share in GDP. And so there is a slight fall in what goes to the middle 40%. This was actually, this becomes more clear when you look at the growth rate of income in real terms for each of these income ranges. And you see that the bottom 50%, focusing on the black bars here only, had quite some growth in income in the period 2003 to 2010, which is while the commodity boom is happening. Lula's governments here, Lula's two mandates. It also grew a lot between 2011 and 2013. Then since the crisis started, you had it's the bottom 50 actually were the big losers from the current crisis. But then if you look at the middle 40, and even the next 9%, meaning those who are between 90% and the 99%, you see that they also had some real income growth during these periods, and in fact, they even have a larger income growth between 2011 and 13 than in the period before. I mean, they were less benefited by this process, but they were still benefited in absolute terms, not in relative terms, but in absolute terms. The top, as you see, actually had benefited more during the commodity boom than they did afterwards. So here, I mean, already we can say a few things. This is just a chart for those who are less familiar with the current situation, the current economic situation in Brazil, which is not the focus of this talk, but you can see that we're in a deep recession. That's the red line, the current recession, if we compare it to other recessions, which are the other lines. But not only we're in a very deep recession, the second deepest in our history, but also the slowest recovery. And that's the more striking thing about this chart. So we're in the slowest recovery in Brazilian history, right? So what can we draw from that? Well, I mean, what are the similarities and singularities between this process or the economic background Brazil had in these elections and the other countries? Well, squeezed middle, yes, we can maybe talk about a squeezed middle as Gatting and Morgan have framed it, but still doesn't seem to be as striking as in rich economies, especially as even the concept of the middle is different here. I mean, the middle in Brazil, the middle 40%, just for you to have an idea, earns 3 times less than someone in the 40% in the UK, for instance, or Germany. But maybe, yes, the bottom benefited more than the middle. We can talk about that. We can also talk about deindustrialization. We did have a loss of manufacturing jobs, in particular after the global financial crisis. But I would say that these are not elements that can be, I mean, especially if we look around over time, the middle were still gaining in relative terms, so it's hard to make the direct link between these trends and the elections, I would say. But then, if you look at the short run, then yes, then we do see some elements that were present in the other elections. We do see a response to the crisis that is based on austerity, that is based on cuts in social programs, that is based on cuts in public investment that are quite significant. We do see rising inequality after the crisis started, as I showed in the previous chart. And we do see a lot of economic insecurity given how deep this recession was. There's something that Celso talks a lot, has been talking a lot for a long time now, which is the crisis helped foster a general understanding in the population that actually corruption was the source and the cause of the economic crisis. While this is not the topic here, but it's very hard I mean, there are many other factors which include both bad luck and bad policy, but no one actually believes that corruption itself caused such a crisis, such a deep economic crisis. But still, I mean, no one, I mean the people who do research in the area. But the general common sense is that actually the crisis is there because basically politicians are stealing the money. And the money is not even circulating in the economy. You could listen to that concept a lot if you walk around in Brazil these days. And in fact, there is a poll that asks that question, is corruption the cause of the economic crisis? And 67% of Brazilians said, yes, corruption is the cause of the economic crisis. So of course, if we go back to Danny Roderick's idea that you have cleavages that arise from deteriorating economic conditions, here we can clearly see a different type of cleavage, which is not an identity cleavage, it's not an income cleavage, it's basically politicians trying to blame on the left, on the political establishment in general, and even on the state, the actual idea of the enemies here are not the immigrants, or they're not the rich people. It's basically the political establishment and who is corrupt and who is basically stealing the money, and that's why everyone is worse off. And then there's one singular aspect in Bolsonaro's election if we compare to other leaders of the far right around the world, which is it's not only morally conservative or culturally conservative, it's also coupled with economic ultraliberalism. So the Minister of Finance of Bolsonaro is someone who is a PhD from Chicago, but actually the old Chicago school, who basically promotes an agenda that is an ultra neoliberal agenda that is based on an idea of basically cutting the size, reducing the size of the state by cutting welfare programs and so on, and it's explicitly so. And that's, I think, one element that gives us a hint on what's going on, because I think it matches very well with that idea that if the state is to blame, if corruption is to blame, then the solution is not to have a nationalism of the economic nationalism such as Donald Trump's, because that's something that addresses a different type of cleavage, right? The one that blames on the immigrants, the ones that blames on globalization in general. Here it's different. Here the ones to blame and the responsibility is attributed to the state. And so reducing the state and having no state even, having only the market would somehow solve the problem. And that, I think, helps us in this understanding. I'll move quite fast now because I know I'm running out of time. But these are basically, here I'm going to the election data to check what's going on in terms of voting behavior. As very preliminary, I mean, I'm only looking at raw data here. This is basically crossing actual election data. We have data in each city for who voted for each candidate. Here it's only the runoff, so basically you only had Haddad and Bolsonaro in 2018, and then in 2014 you had Dilma Rousseff and Aécio Neves. So here I'm comparing what's the share of votes that goes to Aécio as compared to Bolsonaro between 2014 and 2018. And then on the horizontal axis, I have the average income of this city. So if you have a first look, you see, well, Bolsonaro is actually gaining more ground, he's basically increasing his share as compared to Aécio, who was also based on an anti-PT, an anti-Workers' Party platform, in the richest cities, the cities that are to the right. So the poorer the city in average income, the less they voted for Bolsonaro, or the less they changed their voting behavior. But then, if instead of looking at the average income of the city, if in the horizontal axis, I look at the change in income of the city, what was the loss in income of the city, you see a very different story here. So the cities that actually lost more income between 2014 and 2017, meaning those who were which were more affected by the crisis, are the ones where you see a larger change in voting behavior between those two elections. So Bolsonaro gained more ground in cities that lost more income, but of course, already it gained more ground in the cities that were richer. So that's already something that gives us a bit of the story. And then the second part of the story is based on survey data. Of course, election data, we cannot know who voted and what's the income of the person. We only know the income of the city where these trends were observed. Here I'm looking at the votes in the runoff as well, but then I'm looking per household income based on Datafolha, which is one of the two major surveys that are done. This was done the day before the election, and just for the record, Datafolha actually had it right. In the final result was actually exactly the same as the one we had in the elections. So if we look at that, then we know the average income of the household of the person. And in fact, you see that, again, poor households tend to vote more Haddad. Rich households tend to vote more Bolsonaro. That's something that seems to contradict the idea that basically people who are more vulnerable or more insecure are the ones voting for Bolsonaro. But then again, if instead you look at the change in the share that PT had in the elections, instead of looking at it in an absolute way, between 2014 and 2018, here I even have 2010, you see that, in fact, the loss that PT had, the Workers' Party, was larger for, basically it was larger for the middle here of the income distribution, right? So PT has lost more ground between the two elections in the middle. It has kept more the voters in the bottom of the distribution. And then if you look at the top, the difference between the black bar and the and the red bar is very small, meaning that the rich people or the top of the distribution in Brazil did not change the voting behavior between those two elections. So whatever the story is the story of people who are in this middle here, and in cities who lost income. And that's something I think we know. I'll go by the abstentions. I mean, we have a similar story. I mean, non-voting is larger, has increased more at the bottom and the middle than at the top. Finally, now what? If we draw a lesson, if we take a lesson from this story, which points us towards the role of the crisis and where the crisis hits more and people are more affected by increasing inequality, and the people who are actually suffering larger losses during these periods are the ones who tend to be more subject to voting for Bolsonaro. This tends to be confirmed by the behavior of Bolsonaro's approval and rejection rates after the elections. So if we look at the change between when he was elected and how people thought the government would be, if it would be great or so-so or bad or terrible, here it's only the ones who think that the government is going to be good or great. I'm combining those as the approval rate. You see that from January to April and July, Bolsonaro has lost support in all ranges of income, but those basically between April and July, the red and the black and the red bar, you see that his approval rate fell more at the top or towards the top with people who earn more than 5 minimum wages, than, say, at the bottom and at the very top. The rejection rate, though, you see that he has, of course, a much larger rejection at the very bottom, who even didn't vote for him at the very beginning. But then the rejection rates rose more, again, in the middle of the distribution. Right? So the people who joined this boat later are the ones who left it earlier. And these are the people who are at the middle of the income distribution. So people who are, this seems to confirm the idea that we are under something that we're into something that has some level of economic roots, even if many other aspects enter the story. I mean, people in the middle were more affected by the crisis. People in the bottom were very affected, but already didn't vote for Bolsonaro before. So the ones who actually changed and who are more volatile in their behaviors are the ones in the middle. And those are the ones who are actually leaving the boat of Bolsonaro's government. And why are they leaving the boat? So, and what are the prospects to end and to start the debate here? So first, I mean, this economic situation in Brazil is not changing. So as opposed to Donald Trump, who can still talk about, even if we're starting with a possibility of a slowdown and even a recession in the American economy, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen there, but still you have the 3.7% unemployment rate, which is the lowest in 50 years. And of course, that's something he has as an asset in he will have as an asset in 2022, right? In Brazil, unemployment is still 11.8%, so 12.6 million people we're talking about here. And it's not changing fast enough. We're still in the slowest recovery in history, as I showed you. We're now very sure that we're talking about a lost decade in Brazil in terms of GDP. We're not recovering the pre-crisis level before 2025 if we keep the current pace of economic growth in Brazil. Austerity will also go on. So there are several things in the agenda, and the budget for next year already includes more cuts in social programs, in public investment, even in the minimum wage. Now the minister is talking about cutting in real terms the minimum wage, meaning not covering inflation, which is requires a constitutional amendment in Brazil. So we're talking about a very unpopular type of agenda, which tends to slow down and basically prevent a faster recovery, even in the next 4 years. Plus, what happens in the rest of the world is not helping Brazil either. I mean, we're talking about trade wars, we're talking about a slowdown in the world economy. So I cannot imagine a scenario that suddenly changes and moves the economy faster to the point that Bolsonaro gets to 2024 with 2022 with a scenario such as Trump's scenario right now. This is completely out of the picture. There is nothing that can happen. In fact, what we see is the other way around. We see more scandals, the Amazon scandals, which also have economic impact, foreign investors which are running away, the trade deal between Mercosur and the European Union, which is now threatened by the Amazon scandals. So in fact, I don't think the economic scenario is getting any better. In that sense, I mean, there's two ways to look at this. The first one is that, well, that's really bad for Brazilians, and it's actually increasing inequality. The situation is dramatic and so on. But from Bolsonaro's perspective, that's a problem. Because if the people in the middle who are affected by the crisis actually had hopes in him that by voting on someone who is from outside the political establishment and from outside the left and who doesn't believe in the state and somehow had a different agenda, would solve their concrete material problems, this is clearly not happening. And these people who have left the boat, I do not see them going back to the boat. But then the question that I hope Celso will answer, because as someone who understands more the political system in Brazil, the question is whether these people will go back to, I mean, what kind of agenda will they go for? Because so far, I mean, we moved from an impeachment that is highly controversial as an attempt to solve the economic crisis, already with harming institutions in Brazil quite a lot throughout the process. Now, the same frustration actually was channeled to a far-right fascist type of alternative. And so what happens next is, I mean, is anything worse even possible? Or are we finally managing somehow in the progressive democratic camp to build an alternative that can actually create a dialogue with people's concrete demands and with the economic crisis, solutions to the economic crisis that appeal to these people. So that's I guess, the main challenge now. As I said, I raised more questions than gave answers. And thank you very much.
So here's where we stand. Last year, Brazil elected Jair Bolsonaro as its president, and is probably the most radical elected official in the democratic world right now. He represents the wing of the military that did not accept democratization. You know, he comes from a political family of military who did not accept the end of the military regime. In fact, in the 80s, when the transition had already started, he was bombing his army barracks to demand wage increases. So this is a pretty radical guy, you know? Yeah. He has repeatedly praised torturers, death squads, militias, which are urban protection rackets that control half of Rio de Janeiro. He actually said that his favorite book are the memoirs of Brazil's most infamous torturer. So, again, bad. He wins bigot bingo. He's homophobic, he's misogynistic, he has any kind of prejudice you can probably imagine. He's done worse than you can probably imagine. And we can talk about that later if you want to hear some horror stories. He threatened a coup if he lost election. He actually said that he would not accept an electoral defeat. He said that several times, and at least once, he said, I would not accept defeat, but I can speak for the army, which is basically saying, I would like to have a military coup if I lost. You know? And I know some people who actually believe that if the left had won, there would have been at least an attempt at a military coup. Right, so none of the present-day authoritarians, you know, the guys in this new wave of authoritarian politicians around the world have been as radical as Bolsonaro while they were campaigning. You know, Chavez was not at all that radical when he was campaigning for his first election, and I think the same is true for Orban and Erdogan. So if you look at just at what the guy said at his campaign, it's very hard to find a most extreme candidate than Bolsonaro in world history. You know, he would look radical in the 30s. You know. So, in its origin, Bolsonaro, if you compare him to other populist or authoritarian leaders that gained power in recent years, he's closer in its origin. He's closer to Berlusconi and Chavez than to Orban Erdogan because he found the system broken. You know, he didn't need to slowly corrode a more or less functioning system, you know, like other authoritarian leaders of recent times. So he basically found the country in the most catastrophic situation. Laura has already talked about the 8% fall in GDP in 2 years. There was really a dramatic economic crisis. And there's car wash. We talk a lot about car wash. It's the world's largest corruption probe. It's the world's largest corruption investigation. Every single major party in Brazil was involved, was caught by car wash. Most political leaders were involved in the corruption schemes that were revealed by car wash. The guy who was supposed to win the last election, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, former president, he's in jail due to car wash investigations. So basically, Bolsonaro has really stepped into a political vacuum. You know, there was overall disbelief in the political system. You know, Brazilian trust, the trust of Brazilians in institutions was lower than ever. And there was also, in 2016, we had Dilma Rousseff's impeachment. And that was also a dramatic failure. If you want to talk more about that, we can. But it did not solve the economic crisis. And the guys who seized power were actually at least as corrupt as the leftist politicians that were in power before that. So that made, you know, this feeling that, you know, nothing works and they're all thieves and, you know, the whole system is broken. This feeling became quite widespread. And I should also say that I think it was really bad luck that we had the economic crisis and car wash at the same time, because that created the feeling that Laura talked about, that the politicians just stole the money. No, we were doing fine, then politicians stole the money, and now we lost our jobs, you know. And I have to say, this is wrong. This is clearly wrong. No economist believes that. But it's very hard to avoid, you know, that conclusion if you are an ordinary citizen. You know, Suddenly, you're poor, you lost your job, your business went bankrupt, and you hear on the news every day that politicians stole millions and millions of dollars. So if you look at satisfaction with democracy, Brazil is at the very bottom of Latin America. We're even doing worse than Venezuela, which is quite an achievement. Right. So as I said, Bolsonaro comes from a local political lineage of authoritarians. He's the heir of the military dictatorship. Of the small fringe of people who believed the military dictatorship was great. But that does not mean that he's not inspired by new authoritarians, like Salvini or Orban, especially Orban. His son, Eduardo, who, by the way, will probably be the next Brazilian ambassador to the United States. He's the key figure here because he has international connections to the other authoritarians. And he was chosen by Steve Bannon to lead the movement, whatever that is, in Brazil. Here's Eduardo's tweet saying he's very happy to become the head of the movement for Latin America. Yeah, what can you do? So Eduardo traveled to Budapest, and he learned a lot. And he came back very excited, and he said that he learned a lot from Orban. And one of the things he learned was how to deal with the media, which is kind of worrying because Orban has basically destroyed Hungarian media. Hungarian media was very dependent on official advertisement, on state advertisement, and he basically used that to gain control of all the major media groups in Hungary. So basically, he killed independent media in Hungary by financially strangling it. Bolsonaro has already started doing this. He actually, in his first interview, when everyone thought he would at least try to look a little bit more moderate, he said he was going to suspend official advertisement at Folha de São Paulo, Brazil's major newspaper, because he said bad things about him. He has also changed the law so that the government does not have to publish public announcements on printed media, and companies don't have to print their economic balances on printed media anymore. And that was a very big blow for the economic media, like the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal. And if you think I'm exaggerating, when he announced this measure, he said, "I hope Valor Econômico survives," and left. Valor Econômico is Brazil's top financial newspaper. So he said several times that the media is his main enemy. Which is very impressive because Brazilian media is mostly right-wing. So he's not fighting the socialist media. He's not fighting The Guardian. He's not even fighting the New York Times. He's fighting right-wing journalism because it's journalism, because it's not enough, radical enough, because he will report on his corruption scandals. And also, he's trying to wage a war against Brazil's top media conglomerate, Globo, which is, if you follow Brazilian politics at all, right-wing media group. But it's usually liberal in, quote, cultural issues. Global soap operas are kind of progressive, actually. They have gay characters and LGBT characters and trans characters. But again, this is not a cultural issue. He's going against Globo because Globo reports on his corruption scandals and on his attempts to destroy Brazilian democracy. And he's actually supporting Globo's competition, the smaller media conglomerates who actually accept to be entirely submissive to him. In the Independence Day parade, at the beginning of this month, Bolsonaro watched the parade being cited by the heads of Globo's competitors, trying to send a message that, I'm at war with global. And once again, global is not at all leftist. So this is a very extreme politician who is actually at war with right-wing media because it's not submissive enough. So Eduardo also went to Warsaw, and he also learned a lot there. So in Poland, the Law and Justice Party has tried to follow Orban's footsteps, but hasn't been as successful until now, at least. Recently, the Polish government attempted to reduce the retirement age of Supreme Court judges so that the Law and Justice Party could pack the court with party loyalists. They were following Orban's footsteps. Orban went even further, and he created a parallel justice system that is directly and institutionally submissive to the Ministry of Justice. So basically, Hungary does not have a Supreme Court in the strong sense of the word right now. This is the Bolsonaristas' dream. They are obsessed with the Supreme Court. And it's very easy to understand why, because the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. So if you pack the Supreme Court with loyalists, you basically can rewrite the Constitution without actually breaking any law. You can just, from now on, the Constitution is what the Supreme Court has decided it is. So while he was campaigning, he proposed to increase the number of Supreme Court judges, and so he could fill the court with his allies. He had to withdraw that proposal under heavy criticism because it was very obviously what was happening in Hungary and Poland, right? But after the election, one of his congresswomen, Bia Kicis, which is very, very extreme, as he's very, very radical, a very, very radical politician, proposed to reduce the retirement age of Supreme Court members, just like in Poland. And there was a very intense campaign on the internet, on social networks for that. Also, a Bolsonarista member of São Paulo State Legislature, which happens to be one of the authors of the impeachment requirements against Dilma, Janaína Pascoal. She's actually seen as the moderate in Bolsonaro's party, Yeah, very low bar. She has recently filed to impeach the Supreme Court President, Dias Toffoli, which would open a slot for Bolsonaro ally. And the Bolsonaristas have systematically taken to the streets to demand the impeachment of Supreme Court judges. They don't care about the judges. They don't care if they've done anything wrong. They just want to have the power to nominate extra members to the Supreme Court. So this is a rally call. There was this big demonstration that Bolsonaro himself called on a Sunday in April. And he tried to distance himself from that, but he was the one who started it. And impeach the Supreme Court was one of the most constant slogans at the demonstration. Now, interestingly, he hasn't learned only from the right. There's a lot in common between Bolsonaro and Chavez, which is probably a Latin American thing. In Venezuela, Chavistas have bought the army's support with oil rents and bribes. So that's what makes defeating Maduro difficult, because there's no democratic government, no elected government. There's no government that will have to stand in an election that will offer the military a larger share of oil rent. In Bolsonaro's Brazil, first of all, top government jobs went to army officials, including the vice presidency and all his closest aides. Actually, when parties in his coalition wanted to nominate people for government positions, they were asked, do you know anyone in the military that could fill that position? Do you have allies in the military? We prefer to have military guys in government posts. And you should have said, so they're at the education ministry, they're at the foreign policy, well, more about that in a minute. But they also in economic ministries. And so it's a very, very concerted effort to bring the military to his side. By the way, most of Bolsonaro's closest aides were generals who took part in MINUSTA, the United Nations force in Haiti. Brazilian journalist José Roberto de Toledo called them the Port-au-Prince Republic, the guys who were in Haiti together. He also did a very soft pension reform for the military. The pension reform, well, Brazil needed a pension reform, but it was pretty strict for the overall population and very, very, very soft for the military. It's embarrassingly soft. There was almost no reform at all for the military. That's a bribe. And he's also trying to bring police officers to his side. Actually, at his beginning, I think his support for Bolsonaro was stronger in the police than in the army. Because the army thought he was, well, first of all, he was almost expelled from the army for trying to bomb his army barracks, right? So that's not good. But he's trying to play for his base in the police forces by eliminating penalties against police brutality, and actually probably planning to use police officers as a backup if the military proves to be too moderate. He's actually, there's at least 2 episodes in which they are providing free courses for police officers given by far-right, I would not call them intellectuals, sorry. So this is funny. This is a newspaper printout from when Chavez won his first election, and that's Bolsonaro saying he is a hope for the whole of Latin America, and that he hoped that Chavez would do for Venezuela what the military dictatorship did for Brazil. So basically, he's into dictatorships, and only secondarily on the right-wing thing. He's also playing by Trump's playbook by doing pro-rich populism. He's populist on cultural matters, but he's very, as Laura said, he's very radical in market reforms and this sort of thing. I won't talk too much about this because Laura just has basically covered it. It's interesting to note that reforms have been repeatedly thwarted by Bolsonaro's attacks on institutions. Congress is not likely to vote your reform if they think you're going to shut them down. But this year we saw all sorts of strange things. So at a certain point, there was actually sort of a pact or an agreement between the leaders of Congress and the leaders in the Supreme Court to more or less step in the reform process, because they just didn't trust Bolsonaro anymore to, conduct the whole thing. Now, so here's what we have. We have a very authoritarian guy in power in Brazil right now. And he comes from a native lineage of authoritarianism. He has also learned from new authoritarianism from abroad. And that's very bad. But we must also stress that his coalition is not that solid. In this 9 months in government, there was very intense internal struggle inside his coalition. The first one was between the military and the movement, the Steve Bannon guys. Because right from the beginning, there was this strong possibility that Bolsonaro would be swallowed by the military. that would he become a puppet in the hand of the general. Because the generals are the ones who actually have influence on the army. So he realized that if things just went in naturally, he would just lose influence, and government's reins would be seized by the generals. So he tried to counteract that by creating a Bolsonarista movement, by remaining a populist, by keeping this climate of permanent mobilization and permanent institutional crisis. And to do that, he tried to create his own movement. So his son Eduardo, who we met earlier, is actually trying to build a new party, but that is not going well. And he promotes this nut job, Olavo de Carvalho, who is a guy who lives in West Virginia and does YouTube videos claiming that the Frankfurt School wrote the Beatles songs. And you laugh, but this guy has actually nominated Brazil's education minister. He has actually nominated Brazil's foreign relations minister. So this nut job is very influential in Brazil right now. And it's not because of his own qualities. He doesn't have a political base. It's because he's the ideologue of Eduardo's faction. It's the extremist faction, A couple of days ago, Olavo de Carvalho recorded a video saying that the most urgent task is to create a Bolsonarista militancy. Not a conservative militancy, not a Christian militancy, but a militancy for the boss. So, yeah. In April and May, there was open conflict between the military and the Olavistas. And the extremists won. General Santos Cruz, who was probably the most respected military leader in Brazil, was fired. And Vice President Mourão, who was trying to counterbalance Bolsonaro's radicalism, actually had to tone down his criticism of the radicals. So they won the first round. Radicals won the first round, but relations with the military were stressed. And that is very bad for Bolsonaro because, as I said, he planned to bribe the military into supporting his authoritarianism. So this is a sort of tension, this is a sort of stress. That's very bad for his authoritarian project. So right now, Bolsonaro has failed to consolidate a political movement. He won the election in very specific circumstances. He has the support of the army and of the traditional right-wing parties to a point, but he hasn't managed to create the kind of radical militancy that you'll see, for instance, in fascist parties, And then there's the new crisis. As I said, Bolsonaro was elected to a great extent because car wash demoralized Brazilian politics. He was elected as an outsider who would fight the corrupt politicians and so on. And right after election, he scored a goal by choosing Sérgio Moro, a car wash public face, who happens also to be the judge who sent Lula to prison. And yes, it's a little awkward that the guy who sent Lula to prison became the justice minister of the guy who won. I know. But he's extremely popular as the guy who fought the corrupt politicians and so on. And he's the justice minister. There are, as some of you at least might know, there has been WikiLeaks of car wash. There were leaks that published by the media with conversations between car wash task force members in the past, and they indicate that there was abuse of power on several instances by the judges and the prosecutors. And in one of these conversations, the members of the task force expressed extreme skepticism about Moro's decision to join the Bolsonaro government. We are going to be seen as a political faction. They were right. And what happened was, shortly after the election, corruption charges against Flávio Bolsonaro, another one of his sons, and yes, that's a great family, it emerged that he's crooked. He was involved in corruption, in a corruption scandal. And there were deposits on the account, on the bank accounts of the president and of the first lady. So this is bad. And after that, Bolsonaro tried to cover up. So he openly defied the car wash guys, and he interfered in the federal police. He chose as his general official judge or something, procurador-geral, attorney general, a guy who is usually seen to be soft on corruption, because he wants to get his son out of trouble, and because he suspects if his son gets into trouble, he will get into trouble himself. Also, Bolsonaro sees Moro as a rival. He's much more popular than Bolsonaro. And so if Moro chooses to run for president in 2022, he would probably beat Bolsonaro. So Bolsonaro systematically undermines him in his projects and his initiatives. So that right now, car wash task force members have denounced Bolsonaro. They have criticized him for trying to support corrupt politicians, and this could be explosive. If you look at the scenario in which he won the election, this could go very bad for him. We still don't know the size of this. It's very recent. But if Bolsonaro and the car wash people divorce, that might be a major blow to his authoritarian project. So the record so far is this. No authoritarian constitutional reform was passed. It hasn't, it's only 9 months, but he hasn't been able to change the constitution, to change the way the Supreme Court judges are picked. He hasn't been able to, install censorship or anything like that. So that's the good news. There are also more good news. There were strong conflicts inside Bolsonaro's coalitions between the military and the ideological wing, and between the lavajatistas, which is a car wash in Portuguese, is Lava Jato. And the lavajatistas are the segment of the Brazilian public that support car wash blindly. They might overlook abuses of power by car wash, but they will not overlook corruption by Bolsonaro. So there might be a conflict here, and it's playing as we speak. He's also in a permanent effort to build a radical movement. He had always called people to take on the street, and his demonstrations have a very strong authoritarian flavor. He has interfered in the federal police and in the judicial system. And why that started as an attempt to get out of jail, this might be bad for other reasons, because if he has absolute control of the federal police, for instance, he could use that to persecute opponents. He also has caused a widespread downgrading of Brazilian political discussion. These days Bolsonaro has actually said that he thought it was a good thing that Pinochet killed Michelle Bachelet's father. So this is the sort of thing we're discussing right now. And as Laura has shown, we have much bigger problems right now, and this should not even be an issue, right? We shouldn't even be talking about this. The Chilean president, Piñera, who is also right-wing, is deeply embarrassed by Bolsonaro, and he has to apologize for the things Bolsonaro said. Bolsonaro might actually become a problem for Latin America's right-wing politicians, and all that in 6 months. So there are some risks for the opposition that I think should be talked about. First of all, there's a very high risk that defending institutions might be seen as defending the system. So if it talks about congressmen as corrupt, which some of them are, but some of them are not, And if you defend Congress, you'll probably be portrayed as defending the, corrupt, evil politicians. Also, it's hard to navigate the internal conflicts of the Bolsonaro coalition. It's hard to know what to do about them. For instance, in the case of the military versus the ideological wing, some people said, why don't we impeach Bolsonaro? His vice president is more moderate than him. And again, very low bar. And so he will be a better president. Yeah, but the problem is if you put a general there, will he ever leave, right? Let's say he loses the 2022 election. Is that easy to displace the guy, say, okay, go home? Last time it took 20 years. It's also hard to navigate Bolsonaro against car wash because car wash was very harsh on the political left. It arrested Lula. So the left usually doesn't like car wash that much. And now with the Vaza Jato, with the WikiLeaks of Lava Jato, there are several very serious claims of abuse of power against Moro and some other prosecutors. And the left is having a party of that, which is perfectly understandable, in normal political times. But there's a risk that if we emphasize that too much, Bolsonaro will seize the opportunity to seize control of institutions. Institutions that have been run independently, that have run independently in the last decades as the federal police, who has investigated people who were in power. These institutions might actually be tied. They might be meddled with, and that would be very serious. Because, as I said, it's not only serious because corruption investigations might be slowed, but also because he might use those institutions to persecute opponents. And also, well, you probably know about this. The internal struggles of the opposition are very bad. It's very hard to create a unified coalition between the center-right and the center-left. There are several deeply felt hatreds that come from the last decades of political conflicts. And so far, we haven't been able to police a coalition, to create a coalition of, that includes both the democratic right and the democratic left. And in fact, if we had managed to do that, Bolsonaro would have lost, And that was it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentations. I did not see any reference to this in either of your talks, but based on the occasional video that you see, there is a constant reference to God and the evangelical. You can now talk about an evangelical caucus in the Brazilian Congress. So what I wanted to hear from you is to what extent this transformation in Brazilian demographic, where you had a nominally Catholic country in the 80s, I don't know what the statistics are nowadays, but to what extent the presence of the evangelicals in Brazil has played a significant role in these recent developments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's terrifying. So, Dio mio, this is my comment and SOS. So which part the international political and economical system can play in helping through ecological disasters, environmental issues, economic banning products from Brazil. So which part the international field can help democracy in Brazil?
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I I wanted to ask something about the nature of the nature of the economic crisis right now, because if we think about the crisis in the 80s, it was clear that the answer to it kind of led the coalition. So if we think about the nature of the crisis right now, what could coalesce the coalition around a certain economic issue and an economic answer?
Thank you for the presentation. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Politics. I have two questions for Celso. The first one is, haven't you considered the similarities with Rodrigo Duterte in Philippines? Because sometimes it seems like, like Bolsonaro, he says lots of bad things, and he's a authoritarian in terms of the policies. And you talked about Supreme Court, and it seems like Bolsonaro already realized that there is a feature of Brazilian Supreme Court that is there's too much power granted to justice, to individual justice. And actually, I have a paper on that because when you have too much power granted to individual justice, you have lower costs to judicial independence. And by appointing only one justice, Bolsonaro can cause a lot. And a question for Laura. I had never seen data related to increase or decrease in income associated with vote shares. And what political scientists in Brazil usually do is condition on regions, because regions behave very differently. For example, if you try to associate violence index with vote share, you find a pattern. But if you condition on regions, you find very different patterns in the Northeast and the Southeast. And well, those are my questions. Thank you.
Don't feel obliged on everything, because this would be until tomorrow, right? And still, what, right? So, but if you can kind of respond in this first round, pick some topics that you feel like you can relate to and resonate with, and then we'll open up for the next round.
Sure. Okay. I guess I'll pick first the question on the nature of the crisis, which I think may be one of the main reasons why we have a hard time building a coalition. So to answer Celso's concern, I would say that, of course, we have a history of conflict between the center-left and the center-right, and even within the left. But it's also the case that the understanding of what causes the crisis, and therefore what are the solutions, is very divisive still, right? So of course we have some. It's been now four and a half years of crisis in Brazil, and I think we came a long way in terms of building some consensus in terms of what's going on. We all think that there is a part of the crisis that is explained by external factors. We all think that there is a part of the crisis that is explained by policy mistakes, but then which policy mistakes is the main issue that I think is dividing. For instance, the center-right actually believes that the crisis is in its nature a fiscal crisis, and therefore the response to it is actually to cut public investment and spending, to rebalance the budget, and this is what we've been doing for the past 4 years, and that's part of the explanation of why this has been the slowest recovery in history, in my view, right? But then at the same time, the center-left refuses to even consider some type of fiscal adjustment, and does not offer a response because it's still trying to somehow question even the idea that there was a mistake. during the PT years, and it's even understandable. And somehow the political situation did not help in that process, because, of course, it was sold that the impeachment would solve the crisis. It was sold to the people that then Bolsonaro's election or the labor reform or the pension reform, several steps along the way have led us to this point where even any political agenda, I mean, it lost credibility, right? And so there is no common ground. I mean, among economists, there is some. So everyone thinks that, for instance, Brazil needs a tax reform. We have a very unjust tax system, and that's, I would say, common ground between the center left and the center right, and that's part of the crisis for sure. But then fiscal rules create a huge controversy. We're now having a spending cap that actually freezes public spending in Brazil for the next 10 years. And so this is struggling the budget in a horrendous way. And people don't know what to do instead, what to put in its place. Some people want to preserve it. Some of the center right is behind Bolsonaro's economic agenda, which makes it very hard to create a coalition, because you actually have pro-market reforms being carried on, and so you have support in the financial elites to Bolsonaro in Brazil at the moment still. So it's really, that's, I think, the most divisive aspects, and I would say that there's nothing like a proposal such as, I don't know, the Green New Deal being built. There's no reason for optimism in terms of construction of a new agenda or a new plan that can even function as a starting point for a debate about the solution. There's nothing like that at all in the political spectrum in Brazil. And then on the question on the regions, so we've done that as well. It actually doesn't, I mean, of course you have different patterns. In terms of the absolute level of shares, actually the chart I showed that compares the voting shares with average income of the cities, of course that's basically reflecting regional differences, and you can see that very clearly. But then the chart, when I show the change in income in the city, and the voting share, you actually see the same thing in all the regions. So the cities that lost more average income in the past 3 years have seen a larger increase or a larger decrease in the share of votes for PT across the country in different cities. So that is very clear. But of course you have differences and you have special cases. For instance, Rio is a very special case where it's a very large city with a very big fall in the voting share of PT, which is also the very special case in terms of being the epicenter of the corruption scandals. All the governors were arrested of the state of Rio. It's also the epicenter of the economic crisis. It took a bigger hit from the fall in oil prices. So it's clearly a place, and it's also, to speak about your question, it's also the center, or I would say the main city in terms of the evangelical growth. So everything is in Rio, but if you remove Rio, things look very, very homogeneously that way around the country. So yes, I think that about the international political system and banning products, it's always very hard to talk about this. And the reason why, I mean, it's the same that I was explaining at the very end here. I mean, on the one hand, I mean, the economic crisis itself, of course, makes it harder for Bolsonaro, which is the good part, but then it also makes it harder for 40, 50 million people who are below minimum dignity levels of income, who are now suffering those effects in a very, very hard way. And it's been that way in Brazil. The crisis is hitting the most vulnerable the most. Marcelo has been building data on that, and it's very clear. So it's always hard to call for a measure that will, in the end, who is going to pay for it? Plus, we don't even know if Bolsonaro loses popularity, what will happen next? As Celso shows, a possibility is that it gets worse somehow, more authoritarian and even less. I don't know, or even democratic, but then we get Moro as the president, which I don't even know if it's worse or better at the moment. So it's very hard. But of course, the international action in more general ways has been helping a lot, and the Amazon scandals, I think, have been very important to at least stop a little bit the disaster and the catastrophe that was being built. It's still being built. But I would say that there are brakes that have been put on this.
Can you listen? Okay. Right, about evangelicals, you're absolutely right. This was the first election, 2018 was the first election in which all the four major evangelical denominations supported the same candidate for president. You know, in all presidential elections, there was a split between them. Some of them supported the left, some of them supported the right. It was usually not very ideological. It was mostly political bargaining about, getting access to TV concessions and things like that. But this was the first time in which the evangelicals actually acted together to elect a guy. And I cannot overstate the importance of the evangelical vote and the rise of Bolsonaro. If the evangelical vote had split in the same way as the overall vote, it would have been almost a tie. The group that the left really lost is the evangelicals, who, by the way, are heavily concentrated in the lower middle class group that Laura talked about. So now there's an interesting political conundrum. If you're an evangelical leader, you never had a president that is most in sync with your overall conservative views. But if the faithful are losing their jobs, should you keep supporting this guy? If the rejection of Bolsonaro becomes widespread in the segments of the population that are usually part of evangelical churches, would the leaders keep this supporting Bolsonaro against their flock? I don't think so, because when Lula was president, several of these guys supported Lula very happily, because the faithful, their followers supported Lula in an overwhelming proportion. So they don't want to pick this fight with their followers, I think. So this may be the most important place to look in the following years. So that's an excellent point. Regarding the Supreme Court, I'd like to read that paper you mentioned. And it's true that in the Brazilian Supreme Court, individual judges have a lot of power, much more than in the American Supreme Court. But I'm not sure if that applies to very radical constitutional changes. It's true, if you play your cards right, you may end up being judged by a friendly judge, the way that things work. But let's say you want to change electoral law to completely overhaul it. That will probably demand a majority in the Supreme Court. Because at the same time that one judge has a lot of power, any other judge has a lot of power against him as well. And so I think it would not be hard for one guy to be a Democrat and to stop the Bolsonaro single guy. I don't know. Um, as for the coalition, it's as Laura says, it's whoever solves this economic, whoever comes up with a social pact or something, a social, truce that solves the economic crisis, wins this thing. So that's it. And as for international pressure, I think it's very important, but I feel you should be careful. International actors should not look like they're interfering in Brazilian affairs, because that would allow Bolsonaro to play the nationalist card. It's like the Cuban embargo, So when Macron criticized his environmental policy, Macron was absolutely right in what he said. But he used some expression like the Amazon is ours, like it's the whole world's. And Bolsonaro played that in his propaganda, to saying they want to steal the Amazon from us. And that was the only that's the only time since Bolsonaro took office when the military and the ideological wing were in agreement. Yeah. So this is tricky. By all means, put pressure on Bolsonaro. This may be very effective. For instance, right now, the agricultural sector, agribusiness, which was strongly pro-Bolsonaro in last year's election. If you look at the electoral map and you give darker shades of blue to the Bolsonaro vote, the agribusiness regions is the darkest blue you can find. But these guys are worried because if devastation in the Amazon goes on, Brazil might lose environmental certificates and all those things, and that might hurt agricultural exports. So right now, as strange as it may seem, some agricultural business leaders who are usually very right-wing are actually trying to put a stop to the devastation that Bolsonaro is doing in the Amazon, which is just horrendous, right? So.
Next round. Cádio, Benedito, Henrik, Mauricio, Lena, and Federico.
One question. Thank you for your presentations. And the question is about memory and memory of the dictatorship. Because I was, like many others, shocked at seeing how Bolsonaro and others have been celebrating the dictatorship and torture, which is so shocking that it leads one to believe that then what had happened before. So previous governments, including the Lula government and others previous to the PT, really did not do enough. I mean, there was a void there, a loss, an erasure of the horror. In the case of Brazil, like in many other places, but if you compare it to Chile or Argentina and others, it's Bolsonaro can only do that because there was such an erasure. Just like in Trump has proven that there was an utopia in the age of Obama with color blindedness, and that racism is indeed very deep and very extensive. So my question has to do with that. The role of is it public memory, collective memory, and the past that allows Bolsonaro to do what he's doing every day. Just like Trump is so racist and he can get away with it.
Thank you. My question is actually related, and it has to do with the role of the military. From what I hear, it seems that Brazil spent a lot of energy reforming democratic institutions, but the military seems to have been left alone. So I'm wondering what kind of reforms took place in the military and the security forces in general during the Brazil's democratic turn. And my last question is, we talk a lot about the behavior of people in voting and their sentiments in explaining the rise of these far-right movements. But I wonder about the mistakes that progressive political parties make. And my question is, what mistakes did the PT make? Thank you.
Okay. Henrik? Yeah.
Thank you. My question is about austerity and about whether there is now sort of a focus on the part of the political left and maybe the political center on austerity as at least one of the main causes of the ongoing economic misery, and also whether there's a prospect to build resistance to Bolsonaro by focusing on opposing austerity.
Lena and Federico, wonderful visitors from the Institute for Advanced
Thank
Studies here,
you.
Brazilian
I was
economists.
delighted to
Former
listen to your
professor.
presentations. I'm sorry?
My former teacher in
Yeah. So, renewing generations, intergenerational changes. So, I have a question. It's a political question because you mentioned some risks of the opposition, for the opposition. And Laura said, I don't see how Bolsonaro could really recover and, let's say, improve because he's losing ground. He's losing political support, but he still has 33% of political support, like Lula, 33%. So my question is, I think that's something that could happen. It's not, let's say, for sure. What if there is a revision according to this power abuse of power of the Lava Jato, and if at some point the Supreme Court decides to review all the sentences, etc., and then Lula can be freed. So I think that this is something that could really enforce a radicalization and bring people back to Bolsonaro. And this could happen. We don't know if this could happen or not, because this is what popular movements are asking for, demanding Lula free. So what if it happens? Do you think this is a risk for the opposition or not? Or would this contribute to, let's say, strengthen Bolsonaro in his delirium?
Federico and then Mauricio.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the incredible presentations. One question, very short. It's about economic elites. I think that in the same way that we need to talk about religious dimension of what happened the last years, maybe we can take put in our view what was happening with economic elites, and how to explain this confluence between the political agenda, the moral and religious agenda, and the ultra-liberal agenda. And what happened, do we have any kind of research about the emergence of new economic elites that support Bolsonaro, for example, and how to explain this kind of confluence between the traditional economic elites who support, for example, the traditional right-wing media, and the new one who are more, which are more linked to the Pentecostal world. There is two sides of the question. One is about the origins of this, what is happening, and of course about the risk and the hopes about the possibility of of battles between the sectors, allowing to end this nightmare. Maybe, I don't know.
We have Mauricio. It's good. It's kind of like a critical text is being woven here, right?
Oh, sorry for one more question, and thank you for the conversation. So I just want to add maybe to the two questions that was already posed here. One has to do with the role of Lula in the possibility of having a coalition in Brazil, even either as a party leader, like undermining initiatives maybe, or try to negotiate in some way, and another way as a controversial process. No. So, in what sort what is the role of Lula in this place? And the second has to do with the question of Professor Arcadio. And if possible, I want to hear from you, going beyond Brazil, about the political effects of Bolsonaro's statements praising the dictatorship in Latin America, in Chile and in Paraguay also, no, and that kind of statement in that public opinion. Thank you.
Want to get started? Okay. Okay. One comment, brief question. Yeah.
Thank you. It's going to be a very short one. You both write for Folha de São Paulo. You have a presence in the media, what in my opinion, it's something very important. As a journalist too, I would love to know your thoughts about the role the media played in the elections and during the years Lula and Dilma, for example.
Once we get a start, and then let you know, so we'll have wrap up with some responses from Laura and Celso, and then we'll continue the conversation. We have a reception here on the back, right? So you're all invited to stay. And so let's hear from you guys your final remarks.
Okay, I'll start and I will pick austerity, mistakes of PT, and economic elites, since I guess they are more. Yes, we can share mistakes of PT. We can all talk about the mistakes of PT. I mean, on memory, I do agree completely on the fact that we did not do that job in Brazil as well as, for instance, Argentina has done it, or even Chile. The amnesty that was approved after the dictatorship in Brazil set the stage for this, because it was basically the idea that, well, we forgive what the military have done and the torturers have done, but we also forgive all the resistance and whatever crimes were committed by the political resistance in the left. And so the idea was, let's leave it there at first. But Dilma Rousseff was trying to start something, and that's the part where I don't put, I mean, I'm going to talk about a lot of political mistakes and economic mistakes of Dilma herself, but I would say that that's one good thing that happened in Dilma's government and did not happen in Lula's government. She established and she tried to establish commissions, truth commissions, that were actually going deep into crimes, dictatorship crimes, and try to dig into, for instance, several deaths of people who died and who disappeared, and we didn't know anything about them. And so we tried to start that process, and now, of course, already the commissions have started to be intervened. I mean, Bolsonaro is changing the people who are members of these commissions, and we have done it very late, too little, and I think that's part of the problem. And the fact that he can say these kind of things and just out there, and is really shocking, even to us as Brazilians, especially. I mean, my father was a political refugee, so it's even painful in general. He's talking things such as the president of the law, the bar. How do we say that in? National Bar Association. The father of the president of the National Bar Association was killed in the dictatorship, and Bolsonaro basically told him, "I know what happened to your father. If you want to know, just let me know." And he said it publicly. So it's really cruel. And then he said he was the left. But at first he said, "Oh, if you want to find out what happened to your father,
give me a call.
Give me a call. I'll let you know." I mean, it's really cruel and sadistic and completely. Anyway, it's a disaster. On austerity, well, I do not think we have a. So far, I mean, in the left, yes. In the left, I think it's clearly one of the main pillars of criticism to current agenda and I think there is an understanding that the crisis is lasting so long because of that, and that inequality is increasing because of that, and therefore that there is a role for austerity in the scenario, in the entire scenario, in the picture of the elections, which is one of the things I tried to say with my slides, even if it was a bit messy. But I do not think that this unites so many people, and the reason is the dominant view among economists in Brazil is that austerity was a response to total profligacy and fiscal irresponsibility by the PT governments, and that leads us to the mistakes that we have to talk about in the PT. It is true that PT has, especially in the very end, because if you take the commodity boom years and the 2000s, as I told you, it was possible to increase investment while reducing the debt to GDP ratio, because of course the commodity boom created a scenario that somehow made it possible. Tax receipts were growing very fast tax revenues were growing very fast during that period. But then, since the commodity boom ended, the government did a shift in economic policy that was pretty bad in terms of the composition of the budget, because it decided to do tax cuts for corporations. It implemented, and it actually reduced public investment, direct public investment, but it started to subsidize credit a lot for corporation and other things that actually contributed to the deterioration of the fiscal scenario, even if it wasn't necessarily just spending money as the right tend to interpret. So, but of course it gave some grounds for the type of criticism that actually ended up winning the economic debate in the country, which is, PT broke Brazil, and so the only solution possible is to cut spending, and so basically there's the sacrifice that we're paying now and everything that we're going through is still the fault of PT. It's not necessarily the case. There are some mistakes. At the same time, of course, there is a slowdown there is something that comes from external reasons. There is the mistakes, I would say, are not exactly the ones that are being said in the debate, but still it makes it really hard for the left right now to reunite with the austerity, with the criticism to austerity, because it's very easy, as Celso was saying, the same way as it is easy if the left criticizes car wash to put the left in the idea of, well, it's a corrupt, defending the political corrupt establishment. In the austerity case, it's around the same. It's kind of the same trap, because when we talk about it, then it's very easy to put you in that basket of, these are the people who broke the country, and so it's a problem. That's really the problem. So how to do it? How to criticize the cuts in welfare programs, in social programs, in public investment, and so on, while having a fiscally responsible type of solution is the big challenge. And I think that's where we should head if we want to build this consensus. And I think there are people who are trying to think about these things. Finally, on the economic elites, so a second mistake of the PT years, which doesn't have to do with the shift in economic policy that led us to the slowdown and the fiscal deterioration, but which is very important as well, is that, of course, while the commodity boom lasted, it was very easy to do something in terms of fighting poverty without doing anything in terms of redistributing from the top to the bottom or to the middle. So as I showed you, the redistribution happened from the middle to the bottom, but not from the top. The top maintained its incredibly high share of national income, because we're talking about one of the most unequal economies and countries in the world, throughout the 2000s and in the entire period that we're talking about. And this is it's also Lula's characteristic, the idea to reconcile very interesting. He was, even if he's seen as a radical, even if people talk about him as a radical now, if you actually look at what happened, it was a very moderate type of government that actually even sold as an agenda the idea of, well, everyone is happy. Look, the financial elites are happy, the poor are happy, everyone is happy, I'm governing for everyone. This was always his way to do it, even as a labor, if you look at his past as a labor union, a trade union negotiator, that's even understandable as the type of personality that he has, which is always to try to say, look, I'm pleasing everyone, right? And if you see what happens next, and even Dilma was trying she did the tax cuts, and many of the things that were done after 2011 were aiming exactly to please and to reconquer these financial and economic elites and manufacturing elites who weren't as happy as everyone else at that point. But then, the minute the political shift happened, the same economic elites who were actually gaining a lot, as I showed throughout this period, were backing her impeachment, and then were clearly backing Bolsonaro's candidacy in its majority. And of course, there you can make some distinctions. Now, for instance, it's where he's losing ground quite a lot. I mean, if you go above 10 minimum wage income, you see that Bolsonaro is losing ground. But that's, I would say, the intellectual elite. But if you go to, say, the ground of a financial market firm or bank, and you talk to people who are just low-level employees in these institutions, they are all pro-Bolsonaro. It's the same if you go to public servants that are top public servants in the government, in all spheres of government in Brazil, they're pro-Bolsonaro. If you go to corporate sector, manufacturing sector, business owners in general, they are pro-Bolsonaro. So, I mean, these elites, I would say, I don't see anything new. They've been against the PT throughout the time, even if they gained a lot, and I don't think we can count on them for anything better than this at the moment, unfortunately. I don't see much of a new bourgeoisie, more conscious or anything happening in Brazil at the moment.
Well, yeah. Concerning the memory of the dictatorship, you're 100% right. Brazil did a very bad job of dealing with that memory. As Laura said, Dilma, who was tortured during the dictatorship, she tried to do something. She started truth commissions, like they had in Poland and South Africa, and by the way, that's when problems with the military started. The military were very happy under Lula because he gave them raises. But they, the truth commissions were one moment in which the radical wing at least started having some support among top officials. But of course, and also starting to answer to your questions, if you look at military schools, for instance, what they teach the kids, they gave the kids a much more positive view of the military regime as regular schools. So army officials were actually thought that, well, it's usually not very, very openly pro-torture, but usually says that it was a difficult time, it was the Cold War, so that was kind of the best we could do, and it did more good than bad, and on balance, it was okay, and no government had the courage to step in and force military schools to teach actual proper history. So yes, that's a part of the story. I also think that a part of the nostalgia for the military dictatorship is actually nostalgia for a time of economic growth, especially among the older crowd. Because there was a time of economic growth, not because of the dictatorship, because there was a cycle of high growth that started in democratic years in the 50s and then had another moment in the 70s. But supporters of the dictatorship played their card a lot, that in the 70s growth was very fast. And they don't talk about the crisis that they left as an inheritance to democracy, which was absolutely bad. So the mistakes of the PT. Laura literally wrote the book on the economic mistakes of PT, so I will not go in there. But I have to say, first of all, corruption was real. There was abuse of power in the car wash investigations, but corruption was real, especially in the oil company, the state oil company, which was a symbol for the Brazilian left. It was a symbol of Brazilian nationalism. So it was very bad that under a leftist government, the company was plundered. So this is a huge mistake. There's no way around it. Secondly, I think it also made another mistake. After impeachment, the party, it was a bit understandable, but the party turned to the left, at least in its official documents, in its discourse, and Bolsonaro played that card a lot. So there was an official document from 2016 that said that the left has one of the mistakes of the PT governments was not interfering with corruption investigations and with the Supreme Court and so on. So when you call Bolsonaro an authoritarian during the campaign, he said, "I'm not the authoritarian. These guys are authoritarian." And there was actually a stupid document that was probably written by a bureaucrat, but that should not exist. And so it was the party moved was so with the feeling of hatred for impeachment was so intense that it was very hard to talk seriously about governing again. And so when Haddad reached the second round of the election, it was very hard to moderate, to move to the center, starting from such a militant position. So I think that was also a mistake. As for Lula, as you were saying, I think Bolsonaro trusts that there's going to be a series of decisions by the Supreme Court in the following months that Bolsonaro plans to use as a mobilizing device. One of them is Lula. There's a very strong possibility that he's going to leave jail.
But he's going to go back to jail.
He might go back to jail. I don't know.
Because there's a second lawsuit.
Yeah, that's possible, yes.
Yet,
but he may leave jail. So there's no question that Bolsonaro wants to capitalize on that. And he probably have some success on that. but there's also another thing that might happen is that the left might turn to other topics. So if you go to a leftist demonstration right now, there's a very strong emphasis on Lula livre, on free Lula, and I think that's understandable to a point. But it's also a bit of a problem when you're trying to, let's say, make a demonstration against university cuts, as we were talking about austerity. I think the most impressive anti-Bolsonaro demonstration so far has been by university students after very large cuts were announced. Most of them were reversed because of the demonstrations. That was a victory. But some people complain that if you, let's say, if moderate, centrist students went to the demonstrations and saw everyone with the microphone was saying Lula livre, was saying free Lula. That might be a problem if you want to attract people who are not leftist militants to the demonstration. That's a complicated issue. I think if Lula went out of jail, at least that problem would be solved.
That's true.
So at least we might focus on other problems. So I think it will be used by Bolsonaro. There's no question about it. It's a very divisive issue. I have a graph that says support for Lula's arrest in, I think, July 2018. And it's a circle perfectly split in the middle. It's 50-50. 50% supported, 50% were against it. It's very, very divisive. Because, it's very hard to you should never underestimate Lula, right? This is a guy who went to prison and who actually rose in the polls, after he was arrested, So, it's not something you see every day. If I were arrested, even my mother would forget about me after a couple of months, Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll see. So, this guy is obviously a political force of nature. But on the other hand, I think it's Lula dependency is a problem for the Workers' Party. The party should be promoting other leaders, and it should be shifting the focus to social issues, and not yes, for an agenda, exactly. So, yeah.
The media.
Oh, yeah, the press. Okay. You want to talk about it?
I can say it was terrible, the media during the PT years, and I write for Folha as a columnist, so I can say that without any problem. I'm not part of that. I'm not a Folha employee, and I think Folha and Globo and as Celso said, the right-wing media, which is basically the entire mainstream media in Brazil, has done a terrible job during the impeachment process, for instance, to take the most recent part. Also during Bolsonaro's elections, we were discussing that earlier. I think he was very tolerant with many things that should have been stressed more during this time. Authoritarian statements that were clearly authoritarian. If they would have been said by someone in the PT, the media would put it in it would go crazy. And they were said by Bolsonaro. There was some kind of reluctance in denouncing that, especially as the country was polarized, and the readers tend to be anti-PT in their majority. So it was a problem during the PT years, and during the car wash operations, it was a problem as well. I think that the media used the car wash operation to influence political decisions quite a lot. They would put some news that weren't even, someone would, in a statement, in a testimony, testified and say something against Lula without any proof, and they would put it in the front page the day of some demonstration to foster and to put more people in the streets against Dilma. So this was, I think, an important part of the story. And of course, we have 5 families who own the entire media in Brazil, which already which clearly makes it really hard to counterbalance with the views in economics. In economics, is even worse. The media is completely unified around a neoliberal agenda in terms of the economic agenda.
So, a few brief announcements. In 2 weeks, we will continue the conversation with Lona Pablo and Deborah Yashar, October 5th. You're all invited.
They're very good.
Bring friends. Because I also want to thank Marcelo Medeiros for having been such a wonderful interlocutor with Laura and Celso and bringing them on board. And we are having a timely conference on the Amazon. We're calling Amazonian leapfrogging. We don't want to be caught into this madness of the everyday Bolsonaro spins and stupidities, but also dismantling, right, that come along with that. And we want to think about a long-term vision for safeguarding the Amazon for Brazil and the planet, right? So we're having a wonderful group of scientists in Princeton who are modeling what would be a world without the Amazon. And yesterday we saw some initial results, and it's quite striking what it would do to the planet in terms of global warming, but also even more what it would do to Brazil. So that's and then what can we do in Brazil, right? And which kind of power can we harness through protecting and safeguarding the Amazon? That could be one of the causes that you could say, in which larger issues, right, about human rights, about agriculture, about employment, security, economic security could be dealt in a creative way. So you're all invited, October 17, a conference, and we cannot thank you enough for opening up.
Thank you.
With your incredible history of the present, right? All that you brought, because it's such a murky, tyrannical present, and to have your sense of the history, some of the threads that led to this, but also you're living with the uncertainty, not trying to come with easy, magic bullet renderings of what's going on. And that's the kind of social science that we need, that wrestles with the unknown of the present times. And we cannot thank you enough for opening up the year of conversations at the lab. Thank you.
Thank you.